What if I told you that England was once ruled by a man who was technically alive, but already decomposing? A king so consumed by gluttony, addiction, and self-delusion that his body began to rot while still on the throne. His servants wrapped cloth around their faces to endure the stench. His own family moved rooms to escape the odor. His doctors diluted his opium behind his back. And when he finally died, the people of Britain didn't weep, they laughed. The funeral became a spectacle. The coffin was too heavy to carry. The palace walls had to be reinforced just to move his corpse. This is not just the story of a king who died badly, it's the grotesque unraveling of George IV, the man who turned royalty into parody and power into pity. George IV was once called the first gentleman of England. Handsome, witty, magnetic, he had every gift that royalty could offer and every vice to destroy it. His early life glittered with charm and promise, but deep beneath the brocade and banquets was a man already hollowed by hunger for more women, more wine, more approval, more applause. Where his father, George III, upheld duty and moral restraint, George IV ran in the opposite direction, embracing excess as if his very soul depended on it. The prince who was born to rule became the man who devoured his own kingdom from within, one banquet, one mistress, one bottle at a time. By the end, he was no longer a monarch, not in any dignified sense. He was a swollen, drug-addled figure who could not walk, could not see, could not even sign his name. He slept sitting upright in a specially built chair, because lying down crushed his lungs. His skin sagged and oozed. His legs were filled with fluid. His teeth had fallen out. He could not bathe. He could not eat without choking. And yet he kept eating, kept drinking, kept demanding diamonds and sauces and silks and lies. The palace whispered. The servants gagged. The country looked away in disgust, and the monarchy, once sacred, began to smell like rot. But this story is not just about how a king died. It is about how a man, born with every advantage, used every drop of it to build a prison of his own making. How a crown once meant to symbolize divine order became a tragic hat for a man who couldn't look at himself in the mirror. This is the anatomy of collapse, from radiant prince to ruined emperor, from dazzling hope to public embarrassment. And if you think the death was bad, wait until you see how he lived. Because before George IV became England's living corpse, he was its favorite son, a golden-haired heir who dazzled salons and seduced duchesses, who built palaces and defied parliament, who married in secret, divorced in public, and dragged the monarchy into a soap opera that would make today's tabloids blush. He shaped architecture, styled fashion, and set trends that defined a generation. But every step forward came at a cost of dignity, of duty, of health, and eventually, of the people's love. London adored him at first. The satirical press called him the Prince of Wales, mocking his growing size and scandalous affairs. But behind the humour was a slow-building horror, that the man set to lead the kingdom was already consumed by his worst instincts. The debts ballooned, the mistresses multiplied, the body swelled, and the charm faded. By the time he became Prince Regent, the crown was already cracking. And then came the final act, the kingship. Coronation robes bursting at the seams, over 12,000 rented diamonds glistening across flesh that could barely breathe. The public looked on not with awe, but with nausea. His marriage to Princess Caroline descended into open warfare, fought not in courts but on the front pages. His attempts to block her from the coronation backfired spectacularly. She died shortly after, and the people blamed him. It was the beginning of the end. In his final years, George IV became something out of a Gothic novel. Blind, bloated, addicted to opium, delusional, terrified of death, raging at servants, sobbing in the dark, confessing sins to terrified priests, refusing to let go. His doctors lied to keep their jobs. His staff drew lots to see who would sit beside him during the night. His very presence cleared hallways. His body broke beds, stained chairs, and destroyed the air around him. He ordered the mirrors removed. He could no longer bear to see the creature he had become. When death finally came, it was violent. A burst blood vessel, internal hemorrhaging, blood in the bowels. And still, in those last moments, he cried out for his physician, reaching one last time for the comfort of lies. It was 3:15 in the morning, June the 26th, 1830, when the man who had once been the most glamorous prince in Europe collapsed, bloated and breathless, into the arms of his page. The kingdom did not mourn, they exhaled. And the funeral? It was a circus. The coffin, so heavy it required reinforced floorboards and a pulley system. The embalming, a nightmare. The crowd came not to grieve, but to confirm that the monster was finally gone. Even the Duke of Wellington, a man not known for emotional outbursts, called him the worst man I ever met in my life. In death, as in life, George IV was an ordeal. But to truly understand how it came to this, how England's shining heir became its rotting burden, we must go back to the beginning. To the boy born into gold, to the man who mistook indulgence for power, and to the choices that turned a prince into a parable. In the next episode, we return to the start. To the young George, son of George III, born into a palace of mirrors and expectations, and already longing for the escape that would one day destroy him. Before the stench, before the scandal, before the servants whispered of rot, and the nation recoiled from a king who had become a corpse in waiting, there was a boy born into brilliance. His name was George Augustus Frederick, and when he arrived into the gilded world of Windsor on the 12th of August, 1762, it was as if the heavens themselves had conspired to place every royal blessing into one mortal shell. The firstborn son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, he was England's golden child, destined, adored, and draped in expectation. The cradle he lay in had been carved by the hands of masters. The tutors brought in to shape his mind were the finest money could secure, and the future laid before him throne, power, reverence glimmered like the crown jewels awaiting his brow. And yet, from the earliest moments, something uneasy stirred beneath the surface of that shimmering childhood. For while young George basked in the privileges of rank, he also chafed under its weight. His father, George III, was a man of unbending morality, a king obsessed with duty, discipline, and domestic order. The court he ruled over was one of austerity cloaked in virtue, where frivolity was sin and indulgence an enemy to be slain. And it was into this tightly coiled world that the young prince grew not as a mirror of his father's values, but as their living rebellion. He was clever, undeniably so. Tutors praised his intellect, noting a quickness of tongue and an ease with languages, a grasp of politics, and a flair for charm that made even the most rigid courtier take notice. But with each passing year, the boy who could have been brilliant became the young man who preferred performance. He did not crave understanding, he craved attention. He did not pursue truth, he chased applause. And the applause came easily. For he was beautiful, with high cheekbones, bright eyes, and a grace in movement that made him the instant darling of society. London took one look at the prince and fell in love. At 21, his father granted him Carlton House, a grand mansion nestled in the heart of London's Pall Mall. And it was there, far from the pious eyes of the old king, that George began the transformation that would define his legacy. Carlton House did not become a home. It became a temple to indulgence. He filled it with mirrors, with velvet, with gold leaf and chandeliers, with imported art and fountains and ballrooms that pulsed with laughter, music, and smoke. His parties became legend affairs, so lavish they made Versailles look like a countryside picnic. Courtesans wove through the corridors. Bottles emptied faster than they could be replaced. Fashion designers clamored to adorn him. Painters rushed to immortalize him. And the press, ever hungry, lapped up every juicy rumor of flirtations, debts, and dramas behind the doors of the palace of pleasure. He was still not yet king, but already he was a problem. By the mid-1780s, the prince's reputation was slipping fast. His debts ballooned to obscene levels. Hundreds of thousands of pounds owed to jewelers, tailors, butchers, vintners, and anyone foolish enough to believe the heir apparent would ever settle an account. Parliament grumbled. His father raged. And the people watched with equal parts, horror and fascination, as their golden prince became a spectacle of waste. But George, ever allergic to consequence, simply smiled, posed, and continued. Even his most scandalous act, the secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic, and therefore barred by law from marrying a Protestant heir, was carried out with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied. The marriage, illegal and damning, was both a desperate plea for emotional connection and a reckless middle finger to constitutional stability. He loved her, that much is clear. But he also used her, flashing her presence when it suited him, hiding her when Parliament demanded obedience. Still, Parliament bailed him out, again and again. Because while George was a disgrace, he was their disgrace. The alternative, removing or replacing the heir, was unthinkable. So the dance continued. Then came Princess Caroline of Brunswick. Duty demanded it. Image required it. The union, arranged to silence whispers of Catholic wives and scandalous mistresses, was a disaster from the moment she stepped off the boat. George took one look at his bride and demanded brandy. She, in turn, described him as fat, drunk, and far less handsome than the portraits had promised. Their wedding night ended with George unconscious in a fireplace, and the marriage never truly began. They lived separately, quarrelled publicly, and the child they managed to conceive, Princess Charlotte, was a brief ceasefire in a war marked by venom, sarcasm, and humiliations shared gleefully by the press. By the age of 35, George weighed nearly 250 pounds. His once beautiful face had ballooned into caricature, bloated, sagging, pale, chins folded upon chins. His fingers were so swollen with gout that he could no longer sign his name with ease. And yet he clung to the aesthetic of elegance, with a desperation that bordered on the tragic. Corsets made of whalebone cinched his vast stomach into unnatural shapes. He wore rouge and powdered wigs long after fashion had moved on. His wardrobe grew ever more flamboyant, gold embroidery, jewel-toned jackets, bejeweled boots, all in the desperate hope that style could mask collapse. Behind the scenes, his health was already unraveling. His appetite, once a sign of vitality, had become monstrous. He devoured multi-course meals with mechanical determination, swallowing rich meats and heavy sauces with gasping breath, only to chase them down with champagne, port, brandy, and wine. Reports from his household speak of daily consumption that bordered on suicidal. 5,000 pounds of meat delivered in 6 weeks to Carlton House. Oceanic quantities of alcohol. Rivers of gravy and creams. His stomach distended. His breath wheezed. His bowels rebelled. But he would not stop. Because George was not simply indulging, he was escaping. The pressures of state, the disappointment of his father, the jeers of the press, the loneliness of a life built on performance. He drowned them all in food, drink, and luxury. Every scandal only seemed to entrench him deeper. Every attempt at redemption turned into theatre. And with each passing year, the man who might have redefined monarchy in the Age of Enlightenment became instead its most lurid cautionary tale. And yet even in the depths of ridicule, he remained undeniably fascinating. The public could not look away. He was their prince and their pariah. A man whose brilliance only served to light the path of his own destruction. And when madness overtook George III in 1810, the inevitable happened. The Prince of Pleasure became Prince Regent, and with the title came power, real power. At last, the boy who had been coddled and tolerated was handed the keys to the kingdom. And what did he do with it? That is where we go next. It should have been his triumph. When the old king finally shattered beneath the weight of madness in the year 1810, the moment that George Augustus Frederick had both dreaded and anticipated arrived, he was no longer merely a prince, no longer the glittering scandal on society's tongue. He was now Prince Regent, ruler in all but name. The crown still technically sat upon the fading head of George III, but it was George IV, though not yet called so, who would wield the power. And what did he do with it? He did not reform the kingdom. He did not steady the ship of state. He turned the palace into a masquerade, the monarchy into a costume, and himself into a parody of kingship so bloated, so drugged, and so visibly corrupted that even the throne itself seemed to wince beneath him. The Regency era is remembered in Britain as a time of elegance, of literary flourishing, of architectural transformation. It was the age of Jane Austen and Beau Brummel, of neoclassical facades and social reform. But behind the curtains of refinement stood a man disintegrating in real time. George the Prince Regent was a walking contradiction. He championed the arts while wallowing in ignorance. He supported innovation while refusing to change. He commissioned masterpieces while drowning in vanity. And every ballroom, every banquet, every public appearance masked another step in the long march toward ruin. From the very beginning of his regency, George governed like a man who had mistaken theatre for policy. He surrounded himself not with statesmen, but with flatterers. He viewed political crises as opportunities to perform dressed in satin, trailed by perfumes, hiding the swelling of his limbs beneath embroidered robes. While the nation grappled with the Napoleonic Wars, he sipped fortified wine from crystal goblets and refused to read military reports. While Parliament debated poverty, taxation, and industrial unrest, George was more concerned with the angle of his portraits and the shade of his powdered wigs. His decisions were erratic, his priorities were indulgent. And yet somehow, perhaps through inertia or sheer dread of instability, he was tolerated. But within the palace walls, his spiral deepened. The opium had become constant now, not for pleasure, but for maintenance. Without it, he trembled. With it, he raved. Laudanum, the liquid form of opium, became his daily crutch, sometimes consumed in quantities that would kill an ordinary man. And when the laudanum dulled his senses too much to function, he turned to wine, or champagne, or whatever bottle was closest. Reports from his household during these years describe a ruler who slurred through briefings, who forgot conversations within minutes, who became paranoid that his servants were mocking him even as they carried him, literally, from room to room when his swollen legs could no longer support his weight. And always, there was the food, the grotesque, relentless procession of meats, sauces, pastries and sweets. In one 6-week period during the year 1816, over 5,000 pounds of meat were delivered to Carlton House, not counting poultry, not counting sausages, not counting the oceans of cream and butter and gravy that came with them. These were not festive occasions. These were not state banquets. These were private meals catered, prepared, and served to a man who was already choking on his own size. The servants watched him shovel mouthful after mouthful into his face, gasping between bites, eyes bloodshot, cheeks bulging, sometimes needing to be helped to breathe after swallowing. And still he demanded more. His body had become a battleground. Gout clawed at his joints until he could not hold a pen or lift a fork. Dropsy filled his legs with fluid, swelling them to grotesque dimensions. His stomach distended like a sack of wet grain, covered by layers of silk that did little to mask the reality. And through it all, he continued to dress as though he were still the dazzling young prince of 25 corsets. Straining, boots custom-made to encase ballooned ankles, wigs powdered to distraction. He had become a costume worn by disease. His public image fared no better. The press, which once treated him with indulgent mockery, turned vicious. Cartoons portrayed him as a pig in royal robes, a bloated Dionysus drooling over casks of wine and terrified of mirrors. The people, burdened by post-war recession and furious at the crown's extravagance, began to see George not as a sovereign, but as a symbol of everything rotten in the old order. The more they suffered, the more he seemed to feast. The more they sacrificed, the more he seemed to demand. And yet he remained obsessed with his own legacy. He commissioned buildings grand, gilded, absurd. The Royal Pavilion at Brighton, a dizzying blend of Indian and Chinese motifs, rose like a fever dream by the sea. He expanded Windsor Castle into a vision of royal magnificence, sparing no expense. He ordered art, sculpture, vast decorative schemes, but all of it was in service of image. He was not building Britain. He was building a mausoleum for his vanity. Politically, he was disastrous. His efforts to divorce Princess Caroline turned into a public spectacle of humiliation, with Parliament dragged into a soap opera of infidelity, bribery, and secret testimonies. The people, surprisingly, took Caroline's side. When she died in the year 1821, just weeks after being barred from George's coronation, many whispered that the stress of his persecution had hastened her end. The coronation itself, intended as his moment of supreme glory, became a vulgar display of excess. He appeared draped in silver robes, crowned with over 12,000 diamonds, his corpulence barely hidden beneath layers of ceremonial fabric. Observers described him as a magnificent whale at a masquerade. Dignity had left the building, and as the years wore on, the decline accelerated. His eyesight dimmed until he could barely see. A crude surgery in the year 1829 failed to restore his vision. Soon he could no longer even sign his name, and Parliament resorted to stamping documents with a facsimile of his signature. His mind, ravaged by addiction and paranoia, slipped in and out of coherence. One moment he would rage at a servant for treason. The next he would weep over a memory that had never happened. He claimed to have fought at Waterloo. He spoke of military victories he had never seen. And always he asked for more laudanum. The palace became a tomb. His apartments were sealed against light and sound. Mirrors were removed, lest he catch a glimpse of what he had become. He sat in silence for hours, afraid to sleep, afraid to die, afraid of the judgment he had mocked all his life. Priests were summoned. He confessed sins in grotesque detail, desperate for absolution, even as he continued to gorge himself on forbidden foods. He knew the end was coming, but he clung to every second with a desperation that frightened even his most loyal attendants. And so the Regency passed not as a golden age of graceful leadership, but as a grotesque prelude to a monarchy in crisis. George ruled not with vision, but with vanity, not with discipline, but with delusion. And by the time he officially became King George IV in the year 1820, there was almost nothing left of the man who had once promised so much. In the next chapter, we will enter the final decade, the period when George IV, now fully crowned, descends into something worse than decadence. He becomes a living corpse, dragging the institution of monarchy down with every breath he takes. By the time the crown was formally placed upon his bloated head in the year 1820, George Augustus Frederick was already a ghost of what a monarch ought to be. The coronation was not a rebirth, it was a farce. A grotesque pantomime held together by diamonds and denial, ceremony and perfume, while the man beneath the robes sat trembling, swelling and gasping beneath layers of velvet and illusion. Though now titled King George IV, the truth was far less dignified. His reign was not a beginning, but a prolongation of ruin. And with every passing month, that ruin became impossible to hide, impossible to perfume, and impossible to ignore. Inside the royal apartments, the air had changed. It was thick now, sour, warm and heavy, with something that clung to the curtains and seeped into the tapestries. The scent was not merely of unwashed flesh or spoiled food. It was the smell of decay, of chemical medicine and human failure, of a body rotting while its owner still breathed. Servants began to wrap cloth around their faces. Guests kept their gloves pressed to their mouths. Ministers shortened their audiences. Even Queen Adelaide, wife of his brother William, requested her quarters be moved to another wing entirely. The king's presence lingered in the air long after he had left a room, and it was not majesty that followed, it was the scent of death. But even that, even the stench, was only part of the spectacle. George IV, in the final decade of his reign, had become physically monstrous. His weight surged past 280 pounds, though no one knew the exact figure because no scale would bear it. His legs had swollen so grotesquely with fluid that he could no longer climb stairs, nor walk without assistance. His staff, once trained in court etiquette and royal deference, now served as human hoists, groaning beneath the burden of a king whose own frame had betrayed him. They carried him from chair to chair, from bath to bed, from table to throne, all while trying not to gag at the warmth, the wetness, the folds of sagging flesh that oozed beneath their hands. His skin had lost the tight sheen of royalty. Now it sagged in heavy layers, riddled with sores that refused to heal. Some split open, weeping onto linen. Others crusted over with a yellow film that servants wiped away with cloths soaked in vinegar and laudanum. The king could no longer properly bathe. His size, his condition, his pride. It all made the simplest act of washing a production involving multiple men, pulley systems, buckets, oils, and heavy drapes drawn tight, so no one would see how far the first gentleman of England had fallen. But even with such efforts, even with hourly changes of garments, the smell persisted. And worse than the smell was the warmth. His body generated so much heat that rooms had to be cooled artificially with ice brought in from distant estates. And yet he still ate. Though swallowing became difficult, though breathing required effort, though chewing left him winded and trembling, George IV refused to relinquish the one comfort that had never left him: food. His meals became rituals of grotesque endurance. Chefs were instructed to prepare heavily spiced dishes, curries, gravies, thick sauces, because the king's sense of taste had dulled. Food was shoveled into his mouth between wheezing gasps, sometimes chewed halfway before being washed down with fortified wine. Watching him eat was no longer an act of admiration or service, it was a trauma. Servants tasked with his table work drew lots, hoping to avoid the horror of witnessing their king choke, retch, sweat, and groan through another meal that could very well be his last. The laudanum flowed freely. In quantities that would kill most men, the opium tincture dulled his pain and clouded his mind. Doctors tried to reduce the doses, diluting the drops behind his back, but he noticed. He always noticed. And he raged. He screamed. He accused his physicians of treason, of sabotage, of trying to rob him of his comfort and his dignity, two things he had long since surrendered. Sometimes he swallowed over 100 drops before a public appearance, enough to render him glassy-eyed and slurring, a waxen statue propped in a gilded chair. Diplomats whispered that the King of England was always drunk or drugged. Parliament began to function around him rather than with him, keeping decisions short and ceremonial, stamping royal documents with a mechanical reproduction of his signature because his hands could no longer grip a pen. His mind faltered. In lucid moments, he wept. Not for his people, nor for his nation, but for himself, for the reflection he could no longer face, for the memories he barely trusted. He had all mirrors removed from his chambers. Once a man who had spent hours before polished glass, perfecting the drape of his sleeve, or the curl of his powdered wig, George IV could now not bear the sight of his own face. Visitors described his eyes as cloudy, his gaze vacant, often drifting toward corners of the room as though expecting ghosts. And perhaps he was. For what is a man, still breathing, whose body is falling apart, whose friends have all fled, whose lovers recoil at his touch, whose people resent his very existence? He had become the monarch no one wanted to see. The last remaining courtiers tiptoed around him like nurses in a hospice. Politicians spoke of him as a problem to be managed. The public mocked his name. Caricatures in the press depicted him not as a king, but as a bloated hog on a throne made of empty wine bottles and unpaid bills. And beneath the laughter was a biting truth. George IV was no longer merely disliked. He was despised. The man who had once dazzled salons and inspired architecture now inspired nausea. His reign, which might have been remembered for art, or reform, or grandeur, was remembered for smell, for silence, for pity, and still he clung to life. He slept in a chair propped with pillows, unable to lie flat without suffocating. His breath rattled in his throat like a dying bellows. Attendants reported that he groaned in his sleep, cried out, begged for the pain to stop, then awoke and demanded more food. His bowels no longer obeyed him. His clothes required constant changing. His screams, when the pain surged beyond what the laudanum could mask, echoed through the palace halls and unnerved even the most hardened guards. Ministers braced for his death, expecting it daily. But George, stubborn, terrified, bloated George, would not die on cue. What was once a reign had become a waiting room for death. And then, in the early summer of the year 1830, the end finally drew near. His body, exhausted beyond repair, began to fail in ways even he could no longer ignore. He bled internally, his limbs darkened. He became disoriented, calling for people long dead, speaking of events that had never happened. Clergymen arrived and were horrified by the confessions he poured upon them. Grotesque, sordid, desperate. The man who had mocked morality all his life now sought redemption in the final hours, though no one could say whether forgiveness was even possible for a soul so steeped in self-destruction. He died on the 26th of June, at 3:15 in the morning. But we are not there yet, because even death, for George IV, was not simple. His body, in its final hours, became a battlefield of organs crushed by fat, of a stomach ruptured by excess, of lungs barely functioning beneath the weight of royal flesh. And his death, far from quiet, would become its own grotesque chapter in the story of a king who had turned a nation's crown into a collapsing circus tent. The king was dead. At exactly 3:15 in the morning on the 26th day of June, in the year 1830, the man who had once been England's golden heir, George Augustus Frederick, George IV, drew his final, rattling breath. His enormous head slumped forward onto the shoulder of his page, his bloated chest collapsed in on itself, and for a moment the silence inside Windsor Castle felt like a reprieve. There were no final words of wisdom, no parting glance of peace, just a long, gruesome exhale. A reign that had begun in excess ended in physical ruin. But death did not end the ordeal. It only changed the nature of it. Because even in death, George IV was a burden, a literal one. His body, monstrous in size and already beginning to decompose before life had officially left it, posed a challenge unlike any that the royal household had faced. Doctors who had been treating him in those final months, men like Sir Henry Halford and Sir William Waller, were horrified by the immediacy of the decay. His skin had darkened within hours, the folds beneath his arms and chest already seeping fluid. The stench that had clung to him in life had now multiplied tenfold. Those summoned to prepare the body had to be rotated in shifts, some fainting, others vomiting, as they attempted to wash and wrap what was no longer a man, but a cautionary tale wrapped in royal flesh. The first problem was containment. No ordinary coffin could possibly hold him. His weight, combined with the risk of rapid putrefaction, made it clear that a bespoke solution was necessary. Carpenters were summoned in the dead of night. Orders were sent for Spanish mahogany and sheets of lead. The coffin, once constructed, was a monstrous thing, longer, wider, heavier than anything previously laid in state at Windsor. It required a framework of internal bracing to keep the structure intact. Layers of sealing compounds were applied, not merely for ceremonial preservation, but to mask the stench that now poured from his remains like a curse. Even so, the smell leaked through the cracks. The second problem was movement. The corridors of Windsor Castle, designed for processions of elegance, not the logistics of decay, had to be reinforced. Wooden panels were installed along the floors to prevent structural damage as the weight of the coffin was dragged across them. Doorways were measured, and in some cases widened. The passage from his deathbed to the chamber of repose became an engineering project, complete with pulleys, ramps, and thick ropes to stabilize the grotesque procession. The footmen who once carried kings now hauled something closer to livestock, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their faces twisted in disgust as the bloated body of George IV shifted inside its lead-lined sarcophagus. The third problem was appearance. No royal funeral could proceed without the public display of mourning. Lying in state was a tradition. But what was to be done when the king's own family could not bear to enter the same room as his remains? When the priests flinched at the smell? When the undertakers whispered that the body might rupture if moved too harshly? Still, the rules were the rules. And so, against all wisdom, George IV was placed upon a raised bier inside Windsor Castle, his coffin draped in velvet, his crown glinting beside him, and guards posted in ceremonial silence. But silence was not reverence. Crowds came, not to grieve, not to pray. They came to gawk, to see if the rumors were true, to witness the aftermath of a life so consumed by gluttony and arrogance that even death seemed afraid to claim it. Whispers passed between attendees about the shape of the coffin, the thickness of the walls, the faint odor that lingered despite perfumes and open windows. There were no tears, no wails of sorrow. The atmosphere was more morbid curiosity than solemnity. Children were lifted by their parents to peer over the velvet ropes. Servants exchanged bets on how long the embalming would last before rupture. The monarchy's sacred rites had become a grotesque public theatre. And then came the funeral. St. George's Chapel at Windsor had seen many royal burials. It had held the bones of monarchs and queens, of warriors and saints, but never had it faced a logistical challenge quite like this. The coffin of George IV was so heavy, so oversized, that the vault beneath the chapel floor had to be specially prepared. Pulleys and scaffolding were installed inside the crypt to lower the body with mechanical precision. Masons worked through the night, reinforcing the chamber, widening the access points, and shoring up the walls against collapse. The risk of the coffin falling of the body rupturing was real. The vault reeked of formaldehyde and desperation. When the day came, the procession was slow, awkward, and oddly cheerful. Some mourners whispered jokes beneath their breath. Courtiers who had once curried favor with the king now walked with lightness in their step. Diplomats remarked with thinly veiled sarcasm on the size of the coffin. Even his brother, William, soon to be crowned King William IV, was seen smiling more than protocol allowed. The death of George IV was not a moment of national sorrow. It was a release. The passing of a burden so great that even stone seemed to sigh in relief. The service was brief. There was no eulogy of passion, no outpouring of praise. The words spoken were traditional, impersonal, muttered more from obligation than belief. The hymns were sung half-heartedly. The air inside the chapel was heavy with more than incense. It was heavy with embarrassment, with the weight of decades wasted, with the echo of scandals that clung to the walls like mildew. And then, slowly, mechanically, the coffin was lowered. It groaned as it descended. Ropes strained, pulleys squealed. And when it finally settled into place, there was no applause, no final cry, no patriotic flourish, just a lid, a seal, and the quiet closing of a tomb that held not only a man, but an era of indulgence, decay, and disgrace. The autopsy was not officially published, but word of it leaked almost immediately. Doctors who examined the body reported horrors beyond even what had been expected. Fat deposits so thick around the heart and kidneys that they had crushed the organs into dysfunction. A ruptured stomach, still filled with undigested meat. The liver, bloated and scarred from decades of alcohol. Gout had twisted his limbs into grotesque angles. His hands could no longer open. His legs were filled with clots. His mouth showed signs of internal hemorrhaging. And worst of all, the sheer quantity of fat. It had filled every cavity, suffocated every organ, turned his body into a furnace of slow, relentless death. The Times, Britain's most respected newspaper, printed what would become the most infamous obituary in royal history. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? It went further. No man had ever been so hated. No king had ever been so unloved. No death had ever been less regretted. And this was no editorial flourish. It was the truth. George IV, once the darling of society, the heir of promise, the prince who dazzled and seduced, had died without friends, without grace, and without redemption. Even in the political sphere, his memory was buried as quickly as his body. Ministers toasted the arrival of William. Parliament moved on with visible relief. Artists refused commissions to commemorate him. No monuments were erected in his name. His own niece, the future Queen Victoria, was taught to avoid speaking of him altogether. History did not revise his legacy. It erased it. But some could not forget. Servants who attended to him in those final days spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen, the rot, the rages, the crying fits at night, the fear, the smell. Above all, the smell. It clung to the walls for weeks. It soaked into the stone, and long after the crown had passed to cleaner, leaner hands, the echo of George IV remained heavy, obscene, unforgettable. After the lead-lined coffin was sealed, after the pulley ropes were unhooked and the crypt door bricked shut, after the stench was scrubbed from the palace halls with vinegar and prayer, England did something unexpected. It went quiet. Not the silence of solemn mourning, nor the hush of collective grief. It was a deeper silence, a chosen silence, the kind that seeps through national memory like a fog. George IV had finally died, and the country, rather than weeping, simply looked away. No bells tolled in earnest. No poets wrote in elegy. The monarchy had lost a king, but gained in his absence a kind of relief so profound that it dared not speak its name. The anatomy of that silence was not blankness, it was architecture. In the months following his burial, the palaces were rearranged. His personal chambers, those rooms saturated with disease, perfume, and madness, were repurposed without ceremony. His clothes, too stained and too vast for reuse, were quietly burned. The wigs were boxed and sent to storage. The mirrors, long since removed at his demand, were never rehung. Not even the dust remained where George IV had once ruled in velvet and wine. The spaces that bore his name were renovated, repainted, renamed. At Windsor, the staff moved through the halls without lowering their voices, as though the memory of his heavy breathing no longer haunted the stone. The official court made no public remembrance. There was no day of national mourning. No royal foundation established in his honor. The funeral procession, awkward and ill-received, became the last sanctioned moment of acknowledgement. And when it passed, so too did the obligation to speak his name. It was as if England itself had pressed a cloth over the corpse of memory and turned the page. Ministers refused to debate his legacy. Newspapers stopped printing his likeness. Even in private correspondence, his name faded. Where George III had been spoken of with affection, and King William IV would soon be known for his accessibility and odd warmth, George IV dissolved into euphemism. The late king, His Majesty, recently passed. The former occupant of the throne. Among the aristocracy there was no appetite to remember. They had lived through his tantrums, his extravagance, his humiliations. They had attended his endless, garish parties. They had stood in silent horror as he slurred through state dinners, tripped over his own robes, mistook ministers for waiters, and demanded applause where reverence should have sufficed. They had smiled through clenched teeth as his bloated form was stuffed into corsets and crowned with stolen light. And now that he was gone, they would not feign regret. They simply adjusted their collars and moved forward. Even the royal collection, normally meticulous in its cataloguing of monarchs, relegated George IV to ornamental footnotes. Yes, he had commissioned art. Yes, he had built. The pavilion at Brighton still stood, grotesque and magnificent, a pleasure palace carved from oriental fantasy. Windsor bore the marks of his costly expansions. But the plaques beneath these works did not praise his vision. They merely stated dates. Constructed during the reign of George IV. Passive, discreet, unattached. But perhaps the most brutal silence came not from institutions but from people. The very subjects who had once cheered for the young prince in his prime now ignored his portrait in shame. The working class, ground down by taxes and war, remembered him not as a ruler, but as a parasite. The veterans of Waterloo, limping through London's streets in worn coats, spoke not of his leadership but of the diamonds at his coronation and the mockery he made of their sacrifice. Mothers who had lost sons in service saw in him not a monarch, but a grotesque emblem of everything their children would never become. Spoiled, cowardly, and alive too long. In households across the kingdom, George IV became a warning. Children were told not to eat too much or drink too deep, lest they end up like the king who stank. Servants joked about him behind closed doors. Tavern singers refused to write ballads in his name because no one wished to hear them. His death left no emotional wound, no psychic vacancy. It left only a shallow scar, too shameful to point at, too ugly to forget. But silence, especially royal silence, is rarely absolute. Whispers remained. In the corners of royal kitchens, old footmen muttered stories to new ones. They spoke of the groans in the night, the sticky sheets, the trembling hands reaching for more laudanum. They remembered the screams, the gurgled prayers, the flickering candlelight casting his monstrous shadow across walls lined with portraits of kings who had died with dignity. Some remembered his tears. Others remembered the way he would stare at his own hands, bloated and useless, whispering the names of women long dead. The palace physicians, sworn to discretion, shared tales behind closed doors at gentlemen's clubs. Not to gossip, they claimed, but to educate, to warn. They spoke of the liver shrunken and yellow, of the fat thick as clay, wrapped around every organ, of the eyes clouded and wet. They spoke of the fear they had seen, the childlike sobbing, the final moments where George IV cried out for forgiveness, and then, too late, for morphine. Some kept relics, a piece of furniture from his dressing room, a boot that could fit no other man, a ceremonial glove stretched past reason. But these were not tokens of reverence. They were curiosities, museum pieces in waiting, proof that the legend had once been real. And still, beyond the walls of the palace, England breathed easier. King William IV took the throne. He was not perfect mercurial, occasionally foolish, but he was a man. He walked unassisted. He spoke plainly. He took no mistresses, wasted little money, and when he laughed, it was not forced. His reign, though short, restored a kind of quiet faith. People spoke of a return to normalcy, and in doing so, revealed how abnormal the previous reign had been. Historians, in time, attempted to reclaim the narrative. They pointed to George IV's patronage of the arts, his support of architects like John Nash, the Royal Pavilion, the crown jewels restored. They tried, politely, to call his reign complicated, but even their pens faltered. Because how does one narrate the legacy of a man whose greatest achievement was finally dying? George IV left behind. No heirs, no vision, no policy, no poetry. Only weight. Physical, historical, spiritual. The weight of a crown dragged through grease and wine. The weight of a nation's patience stretched too far. The weight of a legacy buried in silence because to speak it aloud would shame the living. And perhaps, in that silence, lies his most lasting impact. Because some kings are remembered for war, some for peace, some for glory or terror. But George IV gave England something stranger. The memory of shame, so vivid, so grotesque, that it demanded to be buried in silence. And yet history does not sleep forever. It was not a revolution. It was not a war. No flags were torn down, no statues toppled, no monarchs exiled. And yet, when George IV was lowered into his grave, something ancient in the British psyche cracked softly, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. It was not the sound of rebellion, but the slow, aching creak of a nation flinching at its own reflection. For decades, the monarchy had clothed itself in sacredness, in tradition, in divine right and moral example. And now, beneath the weight of one man's ruinous reign, that illusion buckled. The crown, though still polished and placed, no longer glittered the same. The silence that had followed his death, so convenient, so comforting, could not stop the undercurrent of discomfort that now stirred in drawing rooms and council halls alike. People had seen too much, smelled too much. They had watched the slow-motion collapse of a king whose body had become a cautionary tale, whose reign was embalmed not in marble, but in mockery and regret. And though the court did all it could to contain the memory, to scrub the walls, to repaint the portraits, the stain remained. Because George IV had not died in obscurity. He had not passed peacefully, nor with dignity. His death had been public, slow and grotesque, a theatre of physical and moral decay that unfolded in real time. Under the half-lowered banners of the empire he had failed to embody. And now, in the early days of William IV's reign, the question no one dared speak aloud whispered through the corridors of power. What happens when the crown itself becomes laughable? That was the day the kingdom flinched. Not all at once. It was subtle. It began in Parliament, where debates about royal finances grew sharper, less deferential. Members who had once bowed to the sovereign's name now spoke with a new edge, their words lined with the memory of George's endless debts, his grotesque coronation, his petulant efforts to block Princess Caroline from sharing his throne. The public's patience for royal extravagance had been strained to the breaking point. Taxes had been levied to cover his indulgences, his palaces, his costumes, and now the people wanted something in return. Accountability, moderation, a monarch who walked, not one who had to be carried like a rotting idol through silk-draped halls. In newspapers, the satire sharpened. The press, once cautious, now wrote with sharpened knives. They dissected the legacy of George IV with the precision of surgeons. The food, the mistresses, the laudanum, the absurd pageantry of his coronation, the padded boots, the stuffed portraits, the chamber pots, the scent. There were cartoons of the royal family scrambling to distance themselves from the corpse king, as some called him. Artists painted the pavilion at Brighton not as a monument to cultural fusion, but as a bloated fantasy built on meat, spice, and delusion. One particularly savage illustration showed a crown balanced atop a roast pig, weeping pearls of vinegar and blood. In the streets, the monarchy became the subject of pub jokes, of puppet shows, of folk songs that rhymed gluttony with majesty and turned the royal we into the groan of a dying stomach. Even among the upper classes there was discomfort, an unspoken anxiety that the rot of George's reign might not be an anomaly, but a symptom. Had they allowed too much? Indulged too long? Was the monarchy still sacred, or merely theatrical? The new king, William IV, sensed this change with the wary instincts of a man who had never expected to rule. He had spent most of his life as the sailor king, a blunt, practical figure with little taste for excess. And now, wearing the crown that had crushed his brother, he approached it like a man lifting a loaded gun. He dressed simply, spoke plainly, walked when possible, refused unnecessary ceremonies. To the public it felt like rain after drought. To the court it felt like whiplash. But even William could not unmake what George had broken: trust. Because monarchy is more than bloodlines and regalia. It is belief. And belief, once bruised, does not heal quickly. For the first time in centuries, ordinary Britons began to question not just the king but the institution itself. Reform petitions grew in number. Pamphlets circulated calling for limits to royal power, to royal spending. Some dared whisper what would have been treason in earlier reigns. Should the monarchy still exist at all? The memory of George IV, his swollen fingers, his breathless dinners, his silent corridors of shame, had made the unthinkable thinkable. Within the royal household, changes were immediate. Staff were reduced, expenses trimmed, wardrobe inventories were reviewed, and anything resembling George's flamboyant tastes was quietly discarded. Tailors were told to avoid silks. Kitchens were told to curb cream and pork. New protocols were written to ensure no future monarch could descend into such unchecked decay without intervention. Laudanum was banned from royal chambers unless prescribed by a certified physician. Mirror removal was no longer tolerated. The monarchy would perform transparency now, if not from conviction, then from necessity. And yet, despite all efforts to distance themselves from the past, the royals could not outrun the ghost of George. He lingered in whispers, in the quiet flinch of servants whenever a banquet grew too large, in the nervous glances of ministers when a sovereign grew too quiet, too tired, too absent from affairs of state. He appeared in the nightmares of the household doctors, in the songs of dock workers, in the pages of medical journals that used his corpse as a case study in pathological obesity. He was, perhaps, the first modern king to be dissected not just politically or morally, but anatomically. A man whose body had betrayed the myths of divine strength and royal vitality. A monarch who had, quite literally, collapsed beneath the weight of indulgence. And for all the silence that followed his death, this was the part that could not be erased. Because George IV had shown the nation what happened when the sovereign becomes only appetite. When a crown becomes not a symbol of sacrifice, but a garnish atop gluttony. And though England would go on through more reigns, more wars, more parades and jubilees, that image would remain buried deep in the cultural marrow. The bloated king in a chair, gasping for air, begging for more, while his people waited for him to die. That was the day the kingdom flinched. And it would never look at monarchy the same way again. Beneath every crown, no matter how gilded, there are bones. Not just the bones of monarchs laid to rest in royal vaults, but the invisible framework of history itself, the brittle, buried remains of broken reputations, forgotten scandals, and legacies too toxic to parade, but too potent to forget. And in the case of George IV, those bones were enormous. They groaned beneath the velvet and fur. They warped the throne that bore them. They strained the patience of Parliament, the faith of the people, and the illusion of royalty as something sacred and incorruptible. When he died in the year 1830, George left no heir of flesh. But he left behind something far heavier. A question that had never before been asked with such urgency or clarity. What exactly is a king? For centuries, monarchy in Britain had survived by evolving. It weathered regicides, restorations, civil wars, foreign invasions, and internal collapse by constantly reinventing its image. Kings could be warlords or patrons, mystics or merchants, priests or politicians. But what George IV introduced, perhaps unintentionally, was the modern crisis of performance. He was the first monarch whose downfall happened not in battle, but in public, not by blade or rebellion, but by slow, visible, humiliating rot. And the world had watched, with opera glasses, with ink and satire, with quiet horror. His body had become a metaphor long before it became a corpse. The gout-swollen limbs that no longer fit into boots. The corset straining against a gut bloated with cream and self-delusion. The eyes that could no longer see past powdered wigs and diamond threads. The lungs that wheezed not from illness but from excess. This was not a man, it was a monarchy made flesh, and that flesh had turned against itself. No number of cathedrals, no symphonies of Handel, no portrait by Lawrence could cover the truth. George IV had become the living embodiment of everything the crown was supposed to resist. And when he was finally gone, when the palace windows opened again and the servants stopped gagging at the doorways, what remained was not admiration. What remained was dread. Because he had revealed the structural weakness, no one wanted to acknowledge that beneath the regalia, the processions, the lineage, and the divine right, a king was still a man. And men can fall. Queen Victoria was not yet born when George ascended to the regency. But by the time she took the throne in the year 1837, she inherited not only a nation, but a fracture. She was told it was a clean slate, that the monarchy could be remade, that she, young and pure and resolute, could restore the dignity her uncle had poisoned. But beneath every throne she sat upon, the bones of George were waiting. She never spoke of him, not in public, rarely in private. He was a cautionary spectre, a lesson carved in flesh and marble. Do not become him. And so Victoria did the opposite. Where George flaunted mistresses, she celebrated marriage. Where he drank, she disciplined. Where he was flamboyant, she was austere. And where he had ruled by appetite, she ruled by restraint. Her mourning dress outlasted decades. Her image stoic, unsmiling, morally upright, was a deliberate rejection of the debauched carnival that had preceded her. And yet, in trying to escape his shadow, she validated its weight. Because George IV did not simply vanish into the grave, he became a reference point, a before, the low against which all future kings and queens would be measured. At least not like him, they would say. At least upright. At least breathing without wheezing. At least not a corpse in a crown. In that way, he became eternal. Not as a figure to emulate, but as a warning chiseled into the spine of the monarchy itself. Even in architecture, his bones lingered. The Royal Pavilion in Brighton, an architectural hallucination of onion domes and Orientalist fantasy, stood as a fossil of his tastes. Tourists marveled. Locals resented. The state debated what to do with a palace designed like a dessert tray. In Windsor, the halls he had expanded still bore his proportions doorways, made wider, ceilings raised, to accommodate the size of his carriages, his chairs, his appetite. In the royal archives, ledgers of his debts remained, line after line of excess, catalogued in the meticulous handwriting of clerks, too afraid to say no. In museums, his portraits were preserved not for reverence, but for contrast. There he sat, painted slimmer than he ever was, dressed finer than he ever deserved, a man encased in lie after lie, brushstroke over brushstroke. And in medicine, he became a case study. Textbooks began to cite him not by name, not at first, but by description. A royal male, late 50s, deceased from complications of obesity, laudanum addiction, cardiovascular collapse. Over time, the anonymity faded. George IV entered medical history as one of the earliest documented examples of morbid obesity in a monarch. His autopsy, quietly circulated among physicians, revealed layers of fat so dense they had displaced his organs. Intestines fused with hardened cholesterol, veins thickened like bark. His stomach had ruptured from within. The man who had ruled an empire could not digest his own dinner. And yet, even that truth was not enough. Because the monarchy endured, the robes were cleaned, the crown was passed. The throne was reupholstered and photographed and shown to the public on Sundays. The system, built on tradition and pageantry, absorbed the shame like a sponge. It carried on, but something had changed. The people remembered. Not vividly, not with full dates or genealogies, but the idea of him, the bad king, the fat king, the forgotten king, remained. Every time a sovereign stumbled, the name came up like a splinter through history. Every time there was excess, or scandal, or laziness, someone somewhere would mutter, "At least we're not back to George IV." And in doing so, they summoned him again, dragged his bones from beneath the crown, and made the monarchy flinch. Because to rule in his wake is to live under a question. What happens if the people stop pretending? George IV built palaces, but he demolished reverence. He cut the ribbon on an age of scrutiny, of journalism, of satire sharp enough to pierce ermine and gold. He showed the people how the sausage was made, how the crown was padded, painted, propped, and perfumed. And once they saw it, they could never unsee it. That was his legacy. Not the pavilion, not the jewels, not the coats stitched with silver or the boots too wide for feet. His true monument is the uneasy pause that follows any mention of his name, the blank space in textbooks, the grimace behind royal smiles, the subtle act of not remembering. A kingdom does not rise from triumph, it rises from ruin, from the charred embers of failure, from the stink of regret, from the heavy silence that follows a scream too long sustained. When George IV was buried beneath St. George's Chapel in the year 1830, no one cheered. No one truly mourned. England did not explode. It exhaled. The long nightmare of indulgence had ended, not with a revolution, not with fire, but with a body too bloated to lift, a coffin too heavy to carry, and a reign too shameful to remember with pride. And yet, the monarchy lived. That is the strange, resilient thing about Britain's crown. It bends. It stretches. It cracks in private and smiles in public. It survives not because it is invincible, but because it is practiced in pretending, and no reign forced that performance harder than his. In the decades after George's death, the monarchy did not collapse. It rehearsed rebirth. It adjusted its posture, straightened its spine, smoothed its silks, and walked out the back of disgrace into the waiting arms of a nation willing to believe again if only someone would teach them how. It was Queen Victoria who would light that path. 7 years after George's death, she ascended the throne a teenage girl, quiet, devout, unscathed by scandal, untouched by wine and opium, untouched by George. Or so they said. But beneath her demure gaze and black dresses lay a blueprint drawn in his failure. She would not be him. She would never be him. Where he had drowned in excess, she would rise in virtue. Where he had flaunted flesh, she would cultivate myth. She became not a monarch, but a symbol, an idea wrapped in mourning lace, projected onto banners and coins, and the souls of subjects desperate for dignity. And for more than 60 years, she reigned. But make no mistake, that reign rose from ash. The ash of banquet halls stained with grease. The ash of a public trust burned through scandal. The ash of a monarchy that had sat rotting in its own flesh, laughing through powdered lips while its people suffered. George IV had taken the idea of kingship to its grotesque limit, had worn the crown like a costume until even his corpse could no longer play the part. In doing so, he purified nothing, but he revealed everything. He showed the monarchy where it would break. He showed the people where it had already broken. And he showed history what happens when ceremony becomes rot. So, was it worth it? Was the reign of George IV, in all its horror, all its humiliation, worth the weight it placed upon the future? Would Victoria have ruled with such iron restraint if his gluttony had not poisoned the royal image before her? Would Parliament have tightened its grip on royal finances if George had not squandered millions on jewels, mistresses, and imported game? Would the press have learned to bite so fiercely if his reign had not tasted so foul? History rarely gives clean answers. But sometimes, decay is necessary. Sometimes, the body must fail for the bones to be examined. Sometimes, a king must fall so completely, so disgustingly, that the very idea of monarchy is redefined in his collapse. George IV was not the worst man to wear the crown, but he was the most exposed, the most undone, the most posthumously honest, because in his corpse, his real, sagging, gasping, oozing body was the truth of every crown. It weighs, it crushes, it distorts, and when worn without humility, without purpose, without understanding, it will devour the man beneath until all that's left is silk, stone, and silence. So yes, a kingdom can be reborn in ash, but only if it remembers the fire. George IV is not carved into the hearts of his people. He is not sung in their anthems, nor toasted in their feasts. His name is a shadow, a murmur, a stain, and yet he matters. Because in failing so completely, he gave history something pure, a mirror, a warning. A man who began as a prince of promise, and ended as a grotesque parable of everything power can corrupt. And beneath every crown that followed, his bones remained.